G'day, ZiggyD here, and as you can see, I'm now in Act 3 Merciless on my Ethereal Knives Scion in Nemesis League. And in this video today, I want to talk about how to go about keeping your hardcore character alive. I'm going to talk about some Nemesis-specific stuff, but mostly this will be a mixture of beginner-oriented tips for keeping hardcore characters alive, but also some more advanced ones that are specific to the game post-launch. So, let's jump straight into it. Now, the first one I want to start off with is thinking about your primary skill. Now, it's pretty easy to just pick a skill that is, seems cool for whatever reason, or, does a lot of damage or something like that. But it's a good idea to also think about how that skill's going to keep you alive. Your main attack skill should also be functioning to keep you alive as much as possible. Now, that could just be through damage. Say you're using double strike. Maybe your double strike does a ton of DPS and will just kill most things before they can even hit you. So that's, of course, a viable strategy, but lots of different skills have lots of different ways of keeping you alive. Let's talk about something like a Glacial Hammer. Glacial Hammer has a chance to freeze opponents, and this sort of thing is going to keep you alive. CCing your opponents through Glacial Hammer, keeping them frozen, is going to be a very powerful way of keeping yourself alive. So, once you have this idea of how your skill is going to keep you alive, roll with it. So, I'm running EK on my build. Now, EK is, it can do a lot of damage, it does some pretty cool stuff, it scales very well without very much gear, and there's a few different reasons why you might want to use EK. But let's think about EK in terms of how it keeps us alive. So, the first thing is it's a ranged attack, so let's roll with that as much as possible. EK normally has a fairly short range, however. Any sort of ranged attack in Path of Exile is going to help keep you alive just by the simple fact that you're away from most of the damage. So rolling with that, I have as much range on my EK as possible. As you can see, that EK range is pretty long. If I take off faster projectiles and my Kurui ward here, EK has a very tiny amount of range there. So putting on my Kuroi ward, which gives projectile speed, and my faster projectiles, which also gives projectile speed, I have a ton more range. I can almost hit mobs just off screen, so that's going to keep me out of harm's way. Now, the second way is Ethereal Knives does quite a bit of damage in single hits, so a support gem like Life Leech, 7.3 damage leached back as life, is also a really nice way of keeping you alive. So both this range and life leech are the main ways I'm focusing on using what EK gives your build, what EK gives you as a way of keeping me alive. So try and look for these ways with your primary skill, how they're actually going to keep you alive. So the next thing I want to talk about is planning your build with how you have to deal with each source of potential death in mind. So think about the different ways you can die and then try and plan your build around that. And this is generally good practice for any sort of build creation. So the first thing is your primary source of survival. Identify that and try and make sure that that is adequate. So for my build, my primary source of survival is life. This is a life-based build. Your build could be ES, Energy Shield, or it could be an Energy Shield life hybrid or some description like that. So you want to make sure you have an adequate amount of that defensive stat. So for life, in a hardcore sort of build, you want to look somewhere around 200 to 250% added life from the skill tree. So I get a lot of life in my build. I get as much as possible. We've got some here. We've got some really nice nodes up here. Got some really nice nodes here. Just in general, trying to get as much of that life as possible. Making sure you have an adequate amount. If you're planning out a new build and you go back and look at the stats and count up the amount of life you have, and it turns out that it's only got like 100% increased life, then that's probably not adequate, and it's probably not going to do a very good job of keeping you alive in hardcore. Might be viable for softcore, but we're talking about hardcore characters here. So the next thing is your form of mitigation, your primary form of mitigation. Now, this could be armor, it could be evasion, or energy shield can be a sort of a form of mitigation. I more consider that in line with life. However, there's also a few other things that happen. Resistances are a form of mitigation, and unique to my build here is Mind Over Matter, which is energy shield essentially, and this is another form of what I consider to be mitigation. It takes 30% of damage and applies it to your mana, so reducing incoming damage is essentially what mitigation is all about. So you need to also think about whether you're getting enough armor in your build to actually keep yourself going. Now, my current armor with fairly average to okay-ish gear for my level is only 31%, but I have a few other forms of mitigation coming in, like endurance charges and molten shell, that keep me around 50%. 40 to 50% is usually a minimum I aim for armor, and for evasion I like to aim for around 50% when I'm playing sort of a pure evasion build. If you're playing an evasion build, you could also consider whether the acrobatics nodes here are well worth it. These have been buffed recently in the launch patch, so it's worth considering, how can I best enhance and make sure I have enough of my primary form of mitigation and how that's going to help me out in my build. The next thing is you want to think about how you're going to deal with reflect as well. So if you deal a lot of damage, which EK does deal quite a bit of physical damage, it does a bit of elemental damage, but not too much for me to worry about. This deals a fair bit of physical damage. You want to think about how your build deals with that. If you're making like a crit build that deals a ton of damage in single big crits with lots of crit multiplier, you want to think about, do I have a way of dealing with that reflect damage when I do hit a reflect mob? Because you're eventually going to hit a reflect mob, and if you have 400% crit multiplier and when you crit, you're probably going to one-shot yourself. So for crit builds, for example, you might want to take something like, if I can find it, where is Volpact being moved to? Volpact is down here. You might want to take something like Volpact, so you're instantly leeching, and then you're using like a life leech gem to keep yourself alive. Some form of way of dealing with reflect, and in this build, mostly that's a combination of high life, mitigation, and mana shield should keep me alive through physical reflect. Hopefully, that's at least the way I'm planning out. We'll see how it plays out. So that covers the passive tree and building your character. Let's talk about defensive skills. On this character, I am running quite a few defensive skills. Let's actually take this trigger gem out for now so we can talk about defensive skills while leveling, because you're not going to have a trigger gem right at the start. We'll get to that in a second. So the first thing is decoy totem. Most builds should run a decoy totem. If you're not running some form of totem, why not? There's no real drawback to do it. It's a single gem slot, you often really don't need to support it with anything, and there's quite a few different totems you can run. If you have a few extra sockets, you can even make a skeleton totem, which is a spell totem support gem with the summoned skeletons and preferably faster casting as well. That's a fantastic node of way of distracting your enemies and keeping yourself alive. Decoy totem is also fantastic. Decoy totems are hugely tanky once you start to level them up, and they actually aggro most mobs around them, so a great way of dealing with it. When you're coming up against things like bosses or things that deal lots of AoE damage, or in Nemesis League where you're coming up with something like volatile that explodes and you need to keep it away from you so when it explodes it doesn't kill you, then decoy totem is the way to do that. So run a totem if you're not running a totem. There's really no major drawback to it, one gem slot. So the next thing is cursing. You can run plenty of different damage dealing curses to help you out in that way, but I suggest in hardcore, some people might want to go, super fast and use damage dealing things, and that's a viable strategy, but for most of us, I feel like slow and steady wins the race. So I choose to use Enfeeble on most of my builds. Temporal Chains is also a fantastic defensive curse. Enfeeble just deals a flat reduction to the actual damage that enemies deal. So leveled up here, cursed enemies deal 32% less damage, a huge reduction in incoming damage. When we're thinking about, 30% of my damage is going to mana, 30% is being reduced by here. I also have mitigation on top of that, not taking much damage in the end and keeping myself alive. So think about what sort of defensive curse you can run, or whether it's simply better for you to run a damage dealing curse and kill things quickly if that more suits your build. But try and run some form of curse if you're not. So the next thing is, what other defensive skills can you use? We have things like Endurance Cry, which give you endurance charges. If you're if you pick up even 1 extra endurance charges, 4 endurance charges can make quite a big difference. And if you're running Molten Shell, most builds that can benefit from armor, so if you're not a pure evasion character, can benefit pretty well from Molten Shell. So think about running those skills. While you're leveling, however, these do take a while to cast, so they might not be too helpful for you, but you can use them in difficult situations. Another one that I'm using, since I'm an Eldritch battery build and have a lot of mana, is Arctic Armor. I can't run around with Arctic Armor on because it still uses too much mana, as you can see. However, if I'm fighting something like Void Bearers that deal a lot of little fire damage attacks, or something like that deals lots of small projectile physical attacks or something like that, I can simply activate Arctic Armor and it'll reduce the amount of damage I take by a significant amount. This has a flat damage reduction, not even fully leveled up, and that makes a huge difference because it happens before all of your other forms of mitigation. So if I'm in a dangerous situation, I can use my decoy totem, use my curse, and I can pop Arctic Armor and stand there and tank really, really well. And then of course there's defensive auras. Consider what defensive auras you can run and whether it's better for you to run one of those over an offensive aura. So now let's get on to something pretty fun and unique to the 1.0.0 launch, Trigger Gems. I'm having a blast with Trigger Gems, primarily cast when damage taken. Now currently in Nemesis at the time of recording this video, cast when damage taken costs around 10 to 12 chaos, even though it's a quest gem. And that's because everybody who gets this from the quest, and it's in Act 3, Merciless difficulty, it's the library quest, everyone who gets it is going to be using it essentially, because pretty much everyone can benefit from having some form of defensive trigger setup. Now what I'm running on mine is very, very powerful, and it's made a huge difference to the defensiveness of my character. I'm running Enduring Cry, Molten Shell, and Decoy Totem all on that trigger gem. So whenever I take 440 damage, all 3 of these spells go off and keep me alive much better. So I'll actually go ahead and show this off, and that's why I'm in this particular zone. I don't like just standing here just to keep myself nice and dangerous. But as you can see, I take a bit of damage there. My Molten Shell goes off. I actually took a lot of damage there, so my Molten Shell exploded straight away. But as you can see, I've got full 5 endurance charges here. Decoy Totem popped up, distracting them. I should probably go ahead and curse these guys. But as you can see, all of my defensive skills are just going off automatically. Now, the time taken to cast these sorts of defensive skills is actually a pretty big deal. It can get you killed if you're having to constantly recast Molten Shell. So having these on defensive cooldowns like that is very powerful and a great way of keeping yourself alive. So think about what sort of defensive triggers you can run once you get cast on damage taken. And if you can get together 10 or so chaos to buy this before you get to the quest, it's well worth doing that because it'll help keep you alive very well. There's other things you can do with cast on damage taken. You could use something like Cold Snap or some sort of knockback spell to freeze or keep enemies away from you. There's a few different things you can do, but I feel like this is the easiest and most beneficial and effective setup you can possibly run. So let's actually go back to town so I don't rip while I'm doing this video and talk about the next thing, flasks. So flasks are super important in Path of Exile. They're going to keep you alive through more hairy situations than pretty much any other factor in the game, including your, your actual gear and things like that. If you have good flasks and you're keeping an eye on how, upgrading your flasks and making sure they have good mods on them, then they're going to make a huge difference. So, in that note, first thing is make sure you have up-to-date flasks relevant to your level. As you can see, I have pretty much all of my flasks here are the highest level flasks because I can run them now. There's no real reason for me to not do that. Now, next up is the magical mods you want to run on this. So I'm using bubbling on this one. This one's the primary one. These flasks here, the sanctified flasks, already have a very short healing time, but bubbling is an instant heal, and I think having at least one instant heal life flask is super important as kind of a panic button. So whenever I take a lot of damage and need to instantly heal myself up and then give me some breathing room, I can use a bubbling flask. Next up, I'm just using an Avengers one. This gives me increased armor during the flask effect. Only lasts for 3 seconds, but heals a lot of life in that as well. Pretty generic sort of one, just a generic life flask for me there. Now over here I'm using immunity to curses during flask effect. This flask runs for 14 seconds as long as my mana isn't full. As long as my mana isn't full, it'll keep healing me in my mana, which is good for my mana shield, and it'll also give me immunity to curses. Curses like Enfeeble or vulnerability cast on you can make a big difference and can actually, can get you killed, so you want to keep those curses off you as much as possible, and this sort of helps there. Running that a long duration flask is really nice. Move speed flasks are nice. I'm using just increased evasion on this and some extra charges so I can run around a bit more and be more defensive when I am running around. I can kind of use it as an escape. And then finally, I'm just running another mana flask here, but I actually want to change this to a staunching flask, which stops bleeding. So a removes bleed flask is super important in Nemesis because there's these mobs that deal bleed stacks to you every time you hit them, and when you get 5 to 10 of those stacks, depending on your build, how much regen you have, they can kill you very quickly. So removes bleed flask, removes that instantly, and I'm going to change this flask to one of those as soon as I get some more alteration shards. So next one is just keeping aware of the challenges you're going to face. So let's go back to Act 3 where I currently am and think about where I'm heading. So just recently I did 2 of the Victor Rose Bust quests, and going into Warehouse District I knew, okay, there's Undying Grapplers in here, and they can grab power charges and then discharge with lightning discharge and deal a lot of damage to you. They're extremely dangerous. There's also a lot of chaos damage in this zone, so I had to be super careful in there, and I had to do whatever I could, like cap my lightning resist and do whatever I could to avoid that. Going into Crematorium, same sort of deal. I knew I had to deal with a lot of fire and a lot of lightning damage for the piety fight in there, so preparing for that as much as possible. If you're going into a zone with a lot of bleeds or some other form of status element, then make sure you have the flask set up for that. Just do everything you can to know what you're getting yourself into each time you progress in the game. And hopefully all of these things will help keep your hardcore characters alive. I hope to see you guys farming MIPs pretty soon. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.